Remember that there's no such thing as scientific racism. My bad. Based on the comments, apparently it is not common knowledge that scientific racism is not real. So let's dive into the origin of the term Semite, the history of scientific racism, and what it has to do with what's happening here. But before we go back to the beginning of scientific racism, I want to skip to the end because that's the most important takeaway. By 1950, genetic science had revealed there was no biological basis to race, and UNESCO released a statement in which they announced there was a consensus among anthropologists that race was a socio-political phenomenon, not a biological one. There was more genetic diversity within races than between races. What do I mean? Well, a dark-skinned person from North Africa might have way more genetic material in common with a lily-white Frenchman than they do with a dark-skinned person from South Africa. But we have been socially conditioned to see dark skin and say black. Well, that's not a meaningful scientific category. A person from Western China may have more genetic material in common with a blonde-haired, blue-eyed lady from Moscow compared to someone from Vietnam. But we've been socially conditioned to see epicanthal folds and say Asian. Again, say it with me, not a meaningful scientific category. This is obvious to me because my kids and their cousins are all of partly Korean and partly European descent. And some of them came out looking white, and some of them look Asian, and some of them get mistaken for Latine. And so a stranger in a lineup would probably sort them into 3 different racial categories, even though these kids have more genetically in common with each other than any other kids on Earth. Unfortunately, as UNESCO said, that socio-political phenomenon of race is very real. My eldest child, who's the darkest skinned, has experienced racist bullying, discrimination in educational settings, and microaggressions from white people on the daily. Whereas my middle child, who's as white as me, has never experienced any of that. And even though we've had consensus for 75 years that biological racism isn't real, based on my comments, there's still a lot of people who think there's something natural about the way that we sort people into these racial categories. But those categories are only about 250 years old, and the initial attempts to categorize people into races look very different from what we use today. That first attempt was made by Francois Bernier in 1684. He lumped all Europeans, North Africans, Middle Easterners, Indians, Southeast Asians, and Native Americans in one race, okay? All those people got to be white in his schema. The second race was Sub-Saharan Africans, the third race was East Asian, and the fourth race was the Sami people. And he was so racist to the Sami people. He called them ugly animals with faces like a bear's. So in Bernier's mind, black people from North Africa, Indian people, Laotians, all were white like him. But the Sami were not white. They were something else, something subhuman. 100 years later, we get a different racial taxonomy in the origin of the term Semite, first used by Johann Christoph Gatterer in 1785 at the birthplace of scientific racism. The Göttingen School in, you guessed it, Germany! Is anybody surprised that Germany invented scientific racism? No? No, nobody's surprised, Germany. So at the Göttingen School, Johann here is the guy who just decides that the time span from creation to the birth of Christ was 4,181 years, which is close. He was only off by 13.7 billion. He also just decides that because the Bible said that Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, settled in Israel, the Mediterranean, and Egypt respectively, that means there are 3 races of human beings. Semites, descended from Shem, were the Middle Easterners, Hamites, who were North Africans from Ham, and Japhethites, descended from Japheth, who became the Europeans. Oh, and also he decides Japhethites are superior to the other races because he said so. And in the 18th century, any old idea could just pop into your head, and if you wrote it down in a book, it became reality. There was no such thing as peer review. Now, somehow, Semite has stuck around as a racial category, but no one talks about Hamites or Japhethites anymore outside of white supremacist Christian cults, and those have been forgotten in favor of the taxonomy of Carl Linnaeus, who in 1767 put forth the black, white, yellow, red Crayola colors racial taxonomy that's still in vogue today. However, there are 2 fucking ridiculous things about Linnaeus's taxonomy that you probably don't know. First, those colors used to describe the races, he wasn't using them to describe skin color. Those stem from humorism, an ancient Greek medical theory that the human body is made up of 4 fluids: blood, which is red, phlegm, white, yellow bile, and black bile, and that all illnesses are caused by imbalances in these humors, which is also nothing. Medically, scientifically, humorism is nothing. In fact, no one before the 19th century had ever referred to East Asians as having yellow skin. The yellow came from Linnaeus's galaxy brain take that I guess East Asians had too much yellow bile. Which, by the way, yellow bile and black bile are also not meaningful scientific fluids. So if you see yellow when you look at an Asian person, or red when you look at an indigenous American person, that is because of social conditioning that stems from this preposterous made-up 18th century racial science, which in turn was based on ancient Greek ideas from the 5th century BCE. The second ridiculous thing about Linnaeus's taxonomy is that there weren't just 4 categories of races, yellow, white, red, black. There was a 5th category. Monsters! That's right, monsters, including wolf boys, giants, dwarfs, and he did not mean people with dwarfism, troglodytes, satyrs, and other mythological creatures. So if you are still seeing the world primarily in terms of black, white, yellow, red people, know that the idea of those racial categories was invented by a dude who also believed in werewolves. Other theories from this time include Benjamin Rush's idea that non-white people were really white underneath a form of non-contagious leprosy, which the scientific world must endeavor to cure. Or Samuel Stanhope Smith's idea that darker skin was caused by one huge freckle that covered the body. Freckles in turn being caused by, of course, an oversupply of bile, which is associated with tropical climates. So yeah, that's the caliber of scientific mind we're dealing with here in the 18th century. Now, in the 1830s, scientific racism gets a big boost from Samuel Morton, who creates the bogus science of craniometry, measuring skulls, to give these racial categories the veneer of being based in evidence. Morton believed in polygenesis, meaning the belief that different races had been created separately by God, as opposed to monogenesis, the belief that all of humanity came from one common ancestry. Morton's data on skulls revealed that white people had the biggest skulls and black people had the smallest, evidence, according to him, that white people had superior intelligence and therefore slavery was justified. However, according to historian Stephen Jay Gould, Morton got these findings by selectively reporting data, manipulating samples, mismeasuring skulls, allowing his bias, either consciously or unconsciously, to skew his results. Skull volume does not determine intelligence, and the bell curve of skull volume is the same across these arbitrary categories of people we call black and white. But the racists of his day loved Samuel Morton for giving them this legitimacy, and he was highly praised and lauded with awards in his lifetime. Then along comes Darwin, and Darwin biographers love to argue about whether or not he was racist. He was a white man living in the 19th century. Yes, he was racist. He was a staunch abolitionist, hated slavery, but he thought there was something to this whole craniometry thing and that it proved white people had superior intelligence. Regardless, Darwin's theory of natural selection was easily adopted by race scientists as proof that Europeans were superior because they had colonized the whole earth and it was survival of the fittest, right? So didn't that make Europeans the fittest? Darwin's ideas also became the basis of a wave of late 19th, early 20th century scientists who embraced eugenics, a monstrous ideology that humanity should be improved through selective breeding. This ideology has been used to justify many genocides across the world, including the Holocaust. Because they believed Jews were of a different race, a race of Semites, because Johann Gottehrer back in 1785 had said so. So scientific racism is nothing. It was dreamed up by these 17th century dillweeds who believed in giants and humors. But it still influences our world today because when protesters chant 5, 6, 7, 8, Israel is a racist state, they are correct. Because Israel has decided citizenship on the basis of biological race. Because I have a Jewish grandmother, I can go claim birthright in Israel and live there even though all my ancestry is like European. Whereas Palestinians, who have actually lived on the land of Palestine for tens of generations, because they are of the wrong race, they don't have civil rights, and at the moment, they don't even have the right to life. If you learned something here today, please show your appreciation by donating to the Palestinian family. That's the first link in my bio. Manar here is in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy and is raising the money to evacuate with 8 of her family members as soon as the border opens. As always, if you donate at least $5 to Manar's campaign, you'll be entered to win this week's book giveaway of a signed author copy of my book, The Free People's Village. And this week I'm throwing in my first novella, Depart, Depart as well, which contains my family's stories from how they escaped the Holocaust. Tell me what was the most wild thing you learned in the comments. And as always, you're amazing. You're my mishpacha. I love you.